What's up? I am David Long. I'm here to talk to you today about this talk that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson did. Well, they did two talks. I wanted to make a video after the first talk, but I put it off, and I'm kind of glad I did, because now I'm going to make one about both talks. And I'm going to try to be kind of short and quick and sort of talk about where I think they both might have gone wrong, how I think it could be better, and how there really is a synthesis to be had between both of their perspectives that I feel just like they couldn't either one of them quite reach. Kind of frustrating, kind of upsetting. I know a lot of people feel like this. So just a real quick sort of who am I and why am I talking about this? I'm an integral philosopher, and the topics that Harris and Peterson are talking about, different aspects of truth and the relative nature of language and religious symbolism, are my main areas of interest. Being a student of Joseph Campbell and Ken Wilber give me a set of distinctions that I think can bring clarity to this topic and these arguments, where it seems like so far there's been mostly just friction and confusion. I have two videos in particular, which I think if you understand these two videos, you will pretty much understand everything you need to know about what's going on with these arguments. One of them is my integral epistemology video, which has to do with different types of truth. We're going to be talking about a lot of the distinctions that were made in that video, which have to do with the Harris and Peterson first talk. And then in the second talk, my other video that relates to that is my video on transrationality, or a post-formal perspective, semantic compatibilism, which is about the relative nature of language on both sides, both trying to show rational scientific people the more artistic and relative nature of their kinds of symbols, and also asking the people who use more poetry and vague talk to qualify their symbols and what they're really talking about. So again, I think if you watch both of these videos, you would have a pretty good idea of what went wrong and what's going on in these different Harris and Peterson talks. But I'm going to try to go in and explain more in detail. Obviously, if you had already watched these two talks, then you would have a better understanding of the details that I'm going to go into, but hopefully that won't be too necessary. Now, in terms of my history with Sam Harris versus Jordan Peterson, to be honest, I'm more of a Sam Harris fan. I think Sam Harris is a really intelligent guy, a really sharp, quick mind on that guy, and I really enjoy listening to his podcast most of the time. If I could sit down and talk with Sam Harris about any ideas, they would actually be these ideas, which is why I get so frustrated with how this talk went down, because I don't really feel like at the end of the day Sam really grasps the value of some of the ideas that Peterson has brought to the table. In part, I think because Peterson didn't do that great of a job in explaining himself. In terms of my knowledge of Peterson, I must admit that this was my first time really hearing about him. This is how I found out about Peterson. I do have some friends and stuff who also know about Peterson through his work with gender pronouns and some of the drama and whatnot that was stirred up around some of that. But for me, this was my first Peterson encounter. And after I listened to the first talk, because I heard that so many people requested for Peterson to talk with Sam, and because I had some good friends who were fans of Peterson, I thought that I must be missing something based on this Harris-Peterson talk. And so I got online and I watched his talk with Joe Rogan and a couple of his other talks, and I was like, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. The reason why people are super excited about this is because this dude is actually pretty fluent in mythological symbolism and understands the truth inherent in some of that symbolism. And of course, that is incredibly powerful, because humans are prone to narrative a lot more than they are prone to facts. Even when we do our best with facts, we like to understand them in the context of some kind of narrative, so science in itself has had to get a lot better at storytelling. Alright, let's get into the context of the first talk. So, basically, an overview of what I see happening is Sam Harris is spending a good amount of the talk, if not all of the talk, trying to point to this absolute truth that is what it is. He calls it the fact of the matter. I think that becomes a problematic way of talking about it. And Peterson, on the other hand, is talking about how ideas can be true enough. So what's happening here? If we look at the integral quadrants that I talk about in my integral epistemology video, I'm basically saying that there are these different types of truth or different aspects of truth. In integral theory, one of our main lenses or tools for perspective taking are quadrants, but it really starts out with this understanding of interiors and exteriors. So we're doing both ontology and epistemology here. Ontology is what is it, and epistemology is how do you know. So we're talking about both what there is, the different aspects of reality, and how we know. And it starts out with this understanding of interiors and exteriors, and that splits further into first person, second person, and third person distinctions or ways of talking. And that goes further still into this further distinction of not just interiors and exteriors, but individuals and collectives. And so now you have not just subjective and objective, but the intersubjective or the relative and the interobjective, which has to do with systems theory. So the distinction between facts and theories, and the distinction between subjective and relative. The idea is that every individual, every instance, is representing all four of these quadrants, that they tetra arise, is what we say in integral theory. The tetra arising of the quadrants. Sounds fun, right? So then within these different quadrants, within these different aspects of reality, there are different approaches to knowledge and different types of study. This is actually extended further into what we call integral methodological pluralism, or what we call zones. And just to give you a quick example, in the upper left quadrant, you can take a first-person perspective on a first-person perspective, like you're giving a report of your own first-person perspective, and that is called phenomenology. Whereas you can also give a third-person perspective on a first-person perspective, and that's called structuralism. In the upper right quadrant, there's also a first-person perspective on a third-person perspective and a third-person perspective on a third-person perspective. So the idea in integral theory is to take into account all these perspectives, all of these approaches to knowledge, and see what they all bring to the table to try to get a more holistic or integrated perspective. The tendency far too often is for people to try to reduce everything to the part of the map or the part of reality that they know about, that they study. So for example, people tend to think that Sam Harris might have a tendency to reduce everything to an empirical approach. That's one of the main criticisms against him, and we'll explore that further. Whereas we also might find that Jordan Peterson might take a more relativistic approach, reducing everything to what's relative or what's good based in human agreement. With an integral approach, we want to realize that these are all just aspects of the truth. So these quadrants almost act as like a type of psychoactive checklist for us to be like, okay, well, yes, that's a factor, but that is not the whole picture. And in fact, if we want to get the whole picture, we know that we're going to have to take into account all of these other factors to really, truly have the most integrative perspective. Now you can take all of this a step further still and expand upwards and notice that the map is not the territory, and that all of our ways of talking about things are relative, in relative human language. And it's not the thing in itself, which is the absolute truth. And there's absolute truth in all four quadrants. Many people know about subjective truth versus objective truth. And maybe some people think that that's the only kind of distinction, that it's this simple kind of duality. But there's subjective truth, there's objective truth, there's relative truth, and there's absolute truth. And even within objective truth, I would say there's a distinction to be made between facts and theories. Theories being collections of facts. Valid theories are theories that are never contradicted by the facts, whereas invalid theories are theories where they don't stand up given all the facts. Anyways, so that's objective. But objective truth and subjective truth are both relative types of truth. Now, this seems to be what Peterson is pointing at, and he mentions Nietzsche a couple times. Think about it this way, right? 2 + 2 is 4 is a very objective, factual statement. But if an alien came down and you showed them 2 + 2 = 4, would they look at it and immediately go, that's truth, I understand that? No, they wouldn't. And the reason that they wouldn't is because it's a truth that is communicated in relative human symbols. And yeah, it's true that all human symbols are equally relative, but some symbols are more accurate than others. They better represent the truth of reality. So there is a distinction to be made between objective facts and the absolute truth and the absolute thing in itself. This is the main distinction that we would want to make if we were, in fact, talking to a simplistic, empirical, reductionist scientist, a simplistic materialist, as many people want to claim that Sam Harris is. This would be one of the kind of things that they might have a hard time understanding, that there's a difference between the fact or the measurement or the symbols being used to talk about what actually happened and what actually happened. There is a difference between the objective and the absolute. And it is this relative barrier or this relative filter of language and meaning through which things get filtered. So as I said, Peterson mentions Nietzsche. I'm tempted to try and attempt the quote from memorization, but I think I'm going to look it up on my phone. Nietzsche's quote about truth is not to say that truth is just whatever, but what he's really getting at is first of all, he's making a truth claim about truth claims. He's not saying there's no truth. He's saying that when we speak about truth, we speak about it in terms that are predetermined by our culture and our society, and that in a way pre-shapes the way that we think about it and conceive of it, because we are already looking at the world through this intersubjective, linguistically mediated perspective. And that in itself is inherently limited and problematic. Let me get this Nietzsche quote for you. What then is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms. In short, a sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that is what they are. Metaphors, which are worn out and without sensuous power, coins which have lost their pictures and now matter only as metal, no longer as coins. We still do not know where the urge for truth comes from, for as of yet we have heard only of the obligation imposed by society that it should exist. To be truthful means using the customary metaphors in moral terms. This is what Peterson is getting at. The obligation to lie according to fixed convention, to lie, heard like in a style obligatory for all. So the idea is that on the front end of these ideas of truth, there is this moral imposition of value. But what Sam Harris tries to point out multiple times is that just because the symbols are relative doesn't mean that they don't match up to an actual thing in itself reality. It becomes difficult because you have to speak about it through symbols. But he gives the example of flipping the coin, heads or tails. Nietzsche gives an example of this. coin, heads or tails? Well, a coin is a cultural construct, and the idea of there being heads or tails is a meaning projected onto the coin. But given something like the fact that we recognize that, and we both say that we agree that we know that heads of a coin represents the side of this actual tangible thing in reality, there is that thing in itself, regardless of if our way of talking about it is culturally constructed. That's all Sam Harris is pointing to the whole time. And the reason why he's saying at the end of the day that Peterson's view is incoherent is not only because he never really does a good job of arguing for it, but also because Peterson is also making a truth claim about truth claims. So he's using the same notion of truth as accuracy, while also trying to say that truth only means goodness. So Sam points this out to him at a couple points, that he's conflating these different ideas, and that becomes incredibly problematic, and that to some extent he is making truth claims, and it is either true or not in an absolute sense. Peterson is either right about what he's saying in an absolute sense or not.
Some of Peterson's fans, they were alleging mostly that I'm a materialist and that I'm somehow dogmatically opposed to the idea that mind might play some role in defining reality or parts of it. But that's just not true, and it's not even relevant as far as I can see. I mean, even if it were true. I mean, if mind helps create reality, I would just claim that we can stand outside those facts as well and say they are true whether or not anyone knows them. If it's true to say that the moon really isn't there unless someone is looking at it, which is to say consciousness is somehow constitutive of its being in reality, well, that fact about the mind's power would be true whether or not any of us know about it or understand it, right? So you can still get a realistic picture of truth being as spooky as you want about the mind. All I was arguing for was that there are facts of the matter whether or not anyone understands them. And some of these facts have nothing to do with the survival of the species. One wonders whether this claim applies to itself. Is this claim about truth only true if it helps us survive? And what if it doesn't? Does it then bite its own tail and just disappear? Do you see the problem there?
And he's making that kind of claim. So the part that makes his argument incoherent is that basically what Peterson is doing is a type of what we would call lower left quadrant reductionism when it comes to truth. He's basically saying that goodness and truth and beauty are all conflatable to goodness. That truth can just mean correct, and if what you like isn't good, then it's not correct. So he's doing this type of lower left quadrant absolutism to the point of absurdity. So his epistemology is ridiculous, and Harris is right to point out to him how ridiculous it is, given tons of examples basically ripping his whole idea to shreds. And the only thing that Peterson seems to be able to say about it is, well, maybe you're right and maybe I'm wrong, and well, yeah, that's what you think and this is what I think. Almost like, well, I have a right to think what I want to think. He doesn't make coherent arguments for why he thinks that, given the logic that Harris just did to break down his entire perspective. He doesn't even really engage with it. He just says, oh, those arguments are toy, they're too simplistic of examples. That's not satisfying. Him just saying that the examples are too simplistic and that they're toy and tries to toss them away. I mean, I see what Peterson is saying about it's easy to make arguments against something when you come up with the parameters to define it. But it also seems like kind of a sneaky way to try to get around having to argue logically for your perspective. So there's no examples where he can demonstrate the goodness and truth of his ideas? Kind of pathetic, very disappointing, a waste of 2 hours, and I'm honestly surprised that Sam Harris had him back on. I think that when he did have him back on, he was a lot less sympathetic to him and his arguments because of how the last talk went. But okay, just to sum up what we just covered. According to the epistemology, Peterson seems like he's going the way of lower left quadrant reductionism to the point of absurdity. What that means is relativistic reductionism. Basically saying it's all relative. It's all just whatever is relative. It's whatever is good. That's the pragmatic reductionism. And he's basically, in a sense, accusing Sam Harris of upper right quadrant reductionism, which would be empirical reductionism, basically saying that truth is reducible to what you can measure with science or with a ruler. And Sam Harris goes to some length, I would say, to say that he understands the relative nature of language, that he includes subjective perspectives, especially as a neuroscientist. He's going to be correlating subjective reports to objective measurements that he can make in people's brains. That's a big part of what neuroscience is about. Neuroscientists are not going to be empirical reductionists, okay? So Sam Harris is making distinctions about all of these factors at play. He's talking about facts, he's talking about subjective experiences and feelings, he's talking about the relative nature of language, and he's talking about the absolute thing in itself. These are all different aspects of truth. And basically, Peterson is only talking about the relative nature of truth and wanting to reduce everything back into that. So this is a reductionist, non-integral perspective, whereas Harris has an integral epistemology. It's pluralistic and it can find different types of truth from all over the place, which is why in the second talk, Sam Harris is pretty receptive for the most part to a lot of what Peterson is bringing to the table in terms of religious symbolism, although it does seem like he needs the extra push into, okay, and why should we care about that? But I'm going to get more into that in a minute. I keep my notes down here. Let's see.
It is like a finger pointing away to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger or you will miss all that heavenly glory.
So, language is a tool, whether we're trying to use it to talk about our subjective experience or an objective measurement. We're using relative value symbols to be able to talk about our understanding of the nature of reality. And within these agreements around terminology, we are able to understand each other, especially around really well-defined language games like we have in logic and science. And man, isn't Sam Harris a pro at using logic and the Socratic method to come up with examples to deconstruct in an Iron Man fashion? That is impressive, very impressive. So when it comes to Harris and Peterson and their views of morality, they definitely approach the project differently. Ultimately, everything comes down to morality for Peterson. And while Harris is willing to say that probably what's good is of utmost importance and that truth is only a means to get at the good, he is also going to say that these are distinct and different things. So the idea is, going back to what I was saying before about agreeing upon the value of a symbol or a quarter and the heads and all that, if we agree about what's at value, in Sam Harris's example, he talks about if good means anything, then it has to do with the well-being of conscious creatures. So if we agree that the well-being of conscious creatures is of value, then it becomes a type of fact claim. This and this and this would be good for conscious creatures. Well, we know what conscious creatures need to thrive for the most part, in the same way that we can make health claims. If these words mean anything within this set of agreements, a certain set of facts can unfold, and we can argue about those facts, and we can figure out what might be better or the best in any given circumstance with science and data and logic. It's not beyond science's ability to comment about. So, in other words, I think going forward, we can have an integral perspective. We can understand the relative nature of symbolism and language, and we can still include the important poetic symbols of other traditions and other cultures and the value inherent in stories and myth and poetry from human psychology and archetypes and all that without having to throw out a realistic conception of reality, that there is an actual absolute truth, there is an actual thing in itself. I don't like calling it the fact of the matter, because fact is that upper right, objective, empirical measurement. Not only do we have this word fact, but we also have this word matter in there. And matter, of course, is referring to tangible exterior reality. And to really have a full picture of the absolute, we would also want to include the interior aspects of reality. Now, maybe on Sam's view, the interior aspects of reality are nested within the exterior aspects of reality, and so when he mentions the absolute in that regard, maybe he is thinking of including those things, but these words fact and matter seem like they're more talking about the relative objective truth than the absolute truth. And that's the type of distinction we're trying to make here. But when he's talking about the fact of the matter, Harris is talking about the absolute truth, or the thing in itself. Naked reality, or naked truth, is what he called it at one point. I thought that was good. Okay, what else we got? So Jordan Peterson, as I said, kind of plays this game where he rejects the micro examples, and he also points to a lot of gaps in science's knowledge, as if that's evidence that it's not the absolute truth, I guess. But many, many times, Sam Harris is willing to say, yes, there are many gaps in our knowledge, and yes, it could be that science shows us that we don't know tons of things, or that lots of the ways that we commonly think about reality are just false or wrong or too small-minded. So these gaps and this micro-macro distinction don't seem to be helpful. They just seem to be blocks that keep Peterson from being able to actually have a reasonable, honest engagement. And I can see that's probably why Sam Harris was unsure about moving forward, is because where are we going to go from here when this dude can't even make any good distinctions? I've given him tons of examples and he hasn't really even dealt with any of them. In fact, he agrees with me on most of them and then just throws up his hands as a way of trying to explain how these two things go together. It seems to me that in terms of just looking at epistemology, Sam Harris sort of demolishes Jordan Peterson's perspective in the first talk. Now, okay, all that being said, when I went to work the next day and I talked to my friend about it, he's a fan of Peterson, and he felt like at the end of the day that Sam Harris was just too concerned with being right, that he came off as arrogant and he wasn't trying to move on or let Peterson talk about other things. Well, I do think epistemology is pretty foundational. I think if you can't get that right, everything you build on top of it is going to be problematic. So that's one thing. But also, I don't listen to Sam Harris's philosophy podcast to hear real nice guys talk about how nice they are. I go on there to hear philosophical distinctions. And I think in the realm that Peterson is working in, there's tons of skillful distinctions to be made, and he's not making them. This is another thing that Sam Harris talks about in regards to this talk. He's basically saying in his recap that if Peterson was actually even good at being a pragmatist, that he would be more skillful at being able to have this kind of a talk. So next we're going to talk about part 2, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into religious symbolism. But I would encourage you to dig a little bit deeper into my video about integral epistemology, and get ready because we're about to talk about part 2.